this section, we'll go through an overview of each of the parts of the report and a description of each entry. We'll open up the report in the next section so that you can see what it looks like in more detail. So there's going to be a screenshot on each slide here, and they're just to give a general view of the layout. So starting with section A, we're asked for project information. So we begin with the project address, and then we enter the stage of the project. And that is going to be from a drop-down menu. So our options here are pre-application or application, rezoning permit, development permit, building permit, and occupancy permit. We're then asked for a project identifier. So usually this would be the permit number associated with whatever stage we're at. And then we're asked for the total modeled floor area in meters squared. Next, we enter the building height in stories. And just a note here that this is actually open-ended. So you could indicate, for example, if there's, a certain level of residential plus some underground parkade, or you could note if the podium is a certain height and a tower above that is a different height. So you can basically just put in there what you think is necessary. Then you have to enter the applicable version of the BC Building Code, including revisions. So that's actually why we first started with the timeline back in a previous recording. And if you can't remember exactly which version is applicable to your project, hover over that cell and a note will appear, and it includes a link to the website where they published the revision number and the associated date for each revision of the code. Next, you indicate what is the jurisdiction you're working in. And this is, again, a drop-down menu, and it actually refers to the list on the second tab. And then you enter the heating degree days for your location, also referring to the second tab, although it doesn't auto-populate because some locations do actually have multiple heating degree day options just because the jurisdiction itself is quite large. Then you enter the climate zone. It's another drop-down menu, and just a reminder, this is based on your BC climate zones, not ASHRAE 90.1. And finally, the date that you're submitting the energy design report. So one thing that we came across when we were first testing out the report was it could be a little bit sticky as to the formatting of the date. So if you use what we've recommended there, that format, then you shouldn't go wrong. So section B is next, and this is for any step 1 portions of the project or portions that are non-step code and so use a baseline model. And you complete this first row, or you complete a row for each non-step code or step 1 major occupancy. So you start by selecting from the drop-down menu what is the major occupancy that you're starting with. And then you move across that row and enter the associated modeled floor area, the performance requirement. So it may be step 1, or it may be that you're doing a baseline building with an ASHRAE 9.1 or any CB baseline, or it could be that you're working somewhere with, say, a rezoning requirement for % better than one of those standards. So use the drop-down menu to indicate which is applicable. And if it's a % better than requirement, then the next cell will open up and you have to indicate what's the number. So is it 15% better than 20%, 25, etc. And in the final the final column, you reference the bylaw, the policy, or the rezoning condition that is driving this performance requirement for your jurisdiction. So if you have multiple occupancies that fall into section B, then you would continue down and do the same thing along the next row for each applicable major occupancy. And then the section at the bottom is for entering the baseline model performance. So you start by entering the baseline annual energy use broken out by fuel type. So there's electricity, natural gas, district energy, and then other. And then in the columns to the right of that, you'll see that there's emissions factors associated with each fuel type, and those will be used to calculate associated emissions and then the associated GHGI factor if that's applicable to your project. A total annual energy use and emissions will be calculated in the second to last row. And the last entry, the bottom left, is asking for the total annual thermal energy demand. And this is going to be used to calculate the TEDI if you have a baseline model. So it's not for step 1 projects, but if you do have to enter this information for a baseline model, just remember to enter it in kilowatt hours. The tool is going to use the modeled floor area that you already provided to calculate the associated TEDI. So just make sure that you don't put in the TEDI value and kind of pre-calculate it, or that will lead to errors in your submission. And then at the bottom right, we get the baseline performance requirements. So just a reminder again, this is not required for step 1 models. It's only if you have a non-step code portion of the building and you're trying to come up with an equivalent TUI, TEDI, and possibly GHGI requirement for that portion of the building to be blended in with the rest of the step code portions. Now this slide actually shows both section C and D. So section C is similar to what we just saw in section B, but it's for portions of the building that are steps 2+. And then section D is just an output calculation, and it calculates the average and weights between sections B and C that we already completed. So just looking at section C very quickly, looks very much like I said as section B did above, where we start out with identifying which major occupancy we're talking about using a drop-down menu. Then we enter the associated modeled floor area, the step, and if there's a GHGI target, then we enter it here. Just note that for this tool to work properly, you have to actually have a GHGI target for all occupancies. Otherwise, it won't calculate properly. Similar to section B, you put in what is the bylaw or policy or rezoning condition that is driving this performance requirement. And then you enter the TUI and TEDI and, if required, GHGI requirement for that particular major occupancy. And as I discussed a little bit in a previous recording, based on the latest revision of the step code, these values now change per your project's actual heating degree day, so it's no longer just based on climate zone. So you want to make sure that you calculate that properly for your project location. And you just continue down entering this information for any major occupancy that has a step code target within your project. You'll see that at the bottom of section C, there's a total modeled floor area for any steps 2 to 4 occupancies. And then as we get into section D, there's a modeled floor area check. So you may recall that in section A at the very beginning, we entered the total modeled floor area for our building. So it's just going to check here that whatever we entered for each non-step code and step code sub-occupancy, that the totals match what we reported in section A. So you'll get a green yes or a red no if there's an error. And on the right-hand side of section D, we get the whole building performance requirements. So those will be our blended TUI, TEDI, and GHGI if required targets for our non-step code and step code occupancies. So in section E, this is where we add our modeled building performance outputs. And this is the output for the entire building. So step code, non-step code, all major occupancies results go together. Now we start by indicating what's the software that we use, and this is from a drop-down menu. And then we put in the energy by end use, and we put it in kilowatt hours, and we indicate what fuel type is associated with that energy end use. So there are 8 set ones that we can use, as well as 3 open-ended areas for our results. So the set ones are pretty straightforward. The open-ended, you can use that for, say, an energy end use that hasn't been included in the group above, or sometimes you'll have one end use that has multiple fuel types. So for example, you may have some heating that's done by electricity and some that's done by natural gas, in which case you'd use the top line to indicate one of those, and then you could use one of these open-ended ones at the bottom here to indicate the other energy end use. And then if you follow those rows to the right, you'll see that we get an emissions factor based on the fuel type and total emissions in kilograms of equivalent carbon. And that will be used in the GHGI calculation if that's relevant to your project. At the bottom of that table, we then get the total annual energy by fuel type. So there's electricity, natural gas, district energy, and other. And then there's the total overall energy end use below that. To the right, where the annual district energy use is shown, as well as the other energy, that's where we alluded to this a little bit before, but if you are using one of those categories for fuel types, then you will need to put in a project-specific emissions factor. So we touched on this in section B, and just make sure that you're putting this in based on either the actual district energy system or whatever is indicated by the applicable bylaw or policy. And that will then be used in the rest of the report to calculate the emissions factors for those fuel types. Below that, there's a section on renewable energy. So any electricity generated on site or purchased renewable electricity or natural gas. And just note that there's that little reminder there that at the bottom that any sort of purchased renewables used for compliance purposes have to be secured to the satisfaction of the authority having jurisdiction. So just make sure that you're meeting all of their requirements if you're using that on your project. Continuing on with section E, there are a couple of background calculations, adjusted emissions factors, and then there's 3 more entries that we need to use, and these are actually fairly important ones. The first one is the annual thermal energy demand for step code occupancies. So just remember when we were talking earlier about the City of Vancouver Modeling Guidelines, section 5, and it says that portions of the building with TEDI requirements have to comply with those requirements prior to being averaged with non-step code portions of the building. So we need to put in the thermal energy demand for those step code occupancies. And a reminder here, just like we've seen in other places on the report, make sure you're entering this in kilowatt hours, not the TEDI result itself. And that value will be divided by the model floor area to give the intensity value that will be used in the comparison. The next entry is the annual thermal energy demand for the whole building. So now we're looking at both step code and non-step code occupancies if that's relevant to your project. If you just have a step code building, then those 2 numbers would actually be the same. Again, enter this in kilowatt hours. And the last one, this is the total annual cooling demand, again in kilowatt hours. And this is actually for information purposes. It's not an official step code metric, but the idea is that they're starting to consider collecting information on cooling the same way that we've done for heating. So we're looking here at the cooling sort of load of the building before any equipment efficiencies are applied, the same way that the TEDI does that for heating. So you can report that there, but again, it's not an official step code metric at the moment. Now there's another section in section E for residential buildings only. And this touches on 3 things. The first one being quarter pressurization adjustments to the TEDI and TUI values, then suite submetering adjustments, and overheating. And I'm not going to go through the calculations in great detail, but those are in the City of Vancouver Energy Modeling Guidelines if you need more background on them. So we're just going to talk here about what's required in the entries here, or what's requested. So for that first metric, quarter pressurization, you have to enter the number of suite doors that are pressurized, the airflow for pressurization per door, so liters per second per door, and then the area of the corridors that are pressurized in meters squared. If there's a GHGI factor on the project, you also want to indicate the makeup area fuel type, and then an emissions factor will be pulled up accordingly based on the fuel type you select. And that's going to be, again, from the regular kind of fuel option drop-down menu that we have. So that's for the first adjustment factor. The second adjustment factor is for suite level submetering. So just a reminder, this is for projects with, say like a central hydronic heating system where people aren't necessarily, if you don't have suite submetering, then people won't be paying their utility bills based on how much they're actually using. They're just paying based on, say, a square footage. And without going into too much background, an earlier study from the City of Vancouver showed that if there's no submetering at the suite level, then people tend to use about 15% more heating energy. So this first entry is just saying, do you have suite level submetering? Yes or no. And then if no, you need to enter in, okay, what is the heating energy that the residential occupancies use? And enter that in kilowatt hours. And there's a nuance here. You want to make sure you're entering the heating energy before that 15% adjustment, because the calculator is going to add that 15% on for you. So if you were to put that in yourself, then you're getting kind of double penalized for that. So you want to make sure you don't do that. Now this last section looks at if the project is passively cooled and therefore subject to overheating limits. So it starts out with a simple yes/no question. And if yes, then you would put in what are the number of overheating hours for your project, and it will give you a yes, you comply, or a no, you do not, depending on the value. However, this whole section is going through some updates. It's already been flagged that there are some errors with it as is. First of all, overheating applies to all passively cooled buildings, not just residential. So this is going to have to be pulled out into a separate section, not under this kind of residential subcategory. And there's also the option in the code that the limit could be 200 hours per year or 20 hours for vulnerable occupancies. Right now is only judging the result against the 200 limit, so that's also going to be added in there. So do expect to see some changes in that area in subsequent iterations of the report. Now the last part of section E summarizes the results and compliance. So the first row across the top is the results from the energy end use that we were entering. What is our TUI, what is our TEDI, and our GHGI result, if that's a part of the project. And then the next two lines are the adjustments for corridor pressurization and suite submetering. So if those apply, you may see values in there, but in this case, it's not a residential building, so they just are set to 0 or NA. Then there's the fourth line, which is the adjusted whole building performance for compliance. So those are the final values that it's comparing with the requirements that were up in section D earlier on. And then these last two rows are just asking, okay, are those values that we've now calculated in compliance with section D? So first it looks at, do the step code portions of the building comply with the TEDI requirements for step code? And in this case, that middle green row or column says, yes, it does. And then the very last row says, does this building comply with the requirements? Here we only have TUI and TEDI requirements, so we're getting a green yes for compliance in both of those cases. So section F is next, and it summarizes key inputs that impact energy performance. So the first couple of inputs are related to geometry. We're asked for the modeled above ground vertical or facade surface area in meters squared. And there's a note there that reminds us to include both opaque and glazed area here. And when we enter that area in, on the right of that, it's going to calculate the VFAR for us. And then the next row, it asks us for the window to wall area ratio. And then again, from that entry, it will calculate the window to floor area ratio and just report that out for us as well. The next section looks at air tightness. So we have to report two values there. The first one is the modeled infiltration rate. And this is from the City of Vancouver modeling guidelines. And it's in liters per second per meter squared of vertical facade area. And then the second value is the air tightness testing target or tested value. And that's in different units. So just, do a double check to make sure that you're using the right units. And that's in liters per second per meter squared of total surface area at 75 pascals. The previous one was at operating pressure. This is at 75 pascals. And just note, if you indicated at the top of your report that this is, say, a building permit or pre-construction phase, then this would be a target value. And if it's the occupancy permit post-construction, then you would be giving the actual result from the testing. The next section has a bunch of envelope inputs. So the first one is average wall effective R value, and be sure to include thermal bridging. And just note this is for above grade walls. So if you have a below grade section, that doesn't get included. And you can see you're asked here to enter the metric R value, and the next column over is actually going to calculate the imperial R value, so you can do a double check if that helps you out. The next row below that is the same thing, but for the roof, average effective roof R value, include thermal bridging, and then average window effective U value. And in this case, if you have multiple window types, then just be sure to provide the average, which would be weighted based on the area that they appear on the building. And then to the right of those entries, we have the average floor edge psi value. And note here that the intent was to exclude sort of at-grade connections. Then the average window transition psi value, and again, be sure to include the header, sill, and jamb if those are different, and make sure that you're providing a linear weighted average in this case if those values are different. And then finally, the average window sill or heat gain coefficient, again weighted by area if there's different values on the project. Next, we see some internal gains that were asked for. So starting with the suite occupant density in meters squared per person. And just note, we're talking about the suite floor area here. And also the lighting power density, average lighting power density watts per meter squared. That one's pretty straightforward. And then the last group of inputs are really related to mechanical systems. So what is the average suite ventilation rate? Again, we're talking here with suite floor area being used when you see that meter squared in the metric. Average HRV effectiveness, and the note, if you hover over that cell, is going to remind you to use SRE. And then the two on the right are related to domestic hot water. So if you have low flow fixtures, what are the total building savings due to those fixtures? And then the one below it is if you have drain heat recovery effectiveness, what is the total for the building? The group of three rows at the bottom ask us for heating system type, cooling system type, and domestic hot water. And you can see that it's kind of been designed with the thought that you might have sort of plant level systems and then suite level systems. Those are drop down menus, and then the last three rows, that last column, pardon me, are just open-ended for other comments. So what we really recommend here is choose the best option for your project and then add notes. So if it doesn't fit exactly, or if you have something that you think needs to be added in just to make sure that there's some context there, just do that in the comments, and that should be able to cover most scenarios. The last section is section G for contact info, and it's pretty straightforward. Name, title, phone number, email, and organization. We touched on this earlier, but when the steering committee was reviewing this form, there was a lot of discussion about this, and it was agreed upon that it really should be the person completing the form who puts their name in here. So that may not necessarily be the modeler. It absolutely could be, but it doesn't have to be. And finally, we also touched on this before, but note that there's the report version in the bottom right of this section. Both has the version and also the date that was issued.